as a way to kind of derail the political ambitions of a particular candidate. So in addition to the notion that Obama was a Muslim, this kind of fictitious idea also emerged that he was not a true American citizen born in America of American parents. Let's put it that way. He either was not a citizen or he had somehow naturalized. That's relevant because then the Constitution stipulates that one is not eligible to run for president if one is not a natural born citizen. So this would have, if true, that's the effort here on the part of some what are known as birthers in the United States, people who believe that Barack Obama's, I guess in the media, are engaged in a monstrous conspiracy to hide the fact that he is not in fact an American. So this was a billboard asking for proof in the form of his birth certificate, which Obama actually did provide, first in a kind of abbreviated fashion, and then after he had come into the White House, this latter picture here is taken from 2011, where these rumors were still persisting. He eventually released his long-form original birth certificate indicating that he was in fact born in the United States, in Hawaii, I believe. My point here simply being that these rumors about Obama and his religion and his citizenship, really his foreignness, persisted throughout the 2008 campaign, into the 2012 campaign, and throughout his presidency. In spite of this release of the long-form birth certificate, many Americans were still not convinced. You may or may not be familiar with this controversy. It emerged relatively briefly, I believe in 2011, when a Tea Party, actually a Republican county, a Republican official in Orange County, California, released this email. It was meant to be private, a private joke, but it got out to the press. As you can see here, it was an effort to try to basically swap out the image of a chimpanzee, a child, and put in the president's face. The aim here was to make play kind of a joke on the notion that he wasn't really born in the U.S. and that he doesn't have a birth certificate. So all of these images are simply by way of conveying the fact that these rumors have been persistent. They continue to this day. I'll get into this a bit later on in the talk, but something on the order of 15 to 25% of Republicans continue to believe that Obama is either a Muslim or not a citizen or both. All right, so that's one kind of image to start out with. But the other point I want to raise at this point is a kind of a separate and seemingly unrelated point of view, and that's about the uniqueness, about the special qualities of the Obama candidacy that made his emergence and ultimately victorious effort to win the White House all the more likely. And I'm going to refer here to a quote by Harry Reid, outgoing Democratic leader in the Senate as a consequence of the more recent midterm elections. And so Harry Reid is in the same party as Obama, and he was quite supportive of Obama. And as you can see by this quote here, this is in a book that came out a few years ago, he indicated why he thought Obama was just the right kind of black candidate to come along at this point in American history, so as to generate sufficient support to potentially win the White House. Draw your attention to the reference here to his light skin complexion, his lack of a Negro dialect, unless of course he wants to have one, all of which was by way of trying to convey the notion that Obama was a different kind of black candidate. A black candidate that might actually be appealing to a sufficiently large size of the American electorate in order to be victorious. So those two things on their face don't seem as if they're connected, but we're going to make the case that they are. That is to say, the negative images of Obama with respect to his citizenship status and his religion, coupled with this notion that he's a different kind of black candidate, a black candidate that is more likely to be successful than previous black candidates. All right. Before I get into the more specific nature of our project, I want to drive home something about the American political system, particularly the way in which the vote choice plays out there, that folks don't necessarily always appreciate. So I think we all have a good sense about the extent to which there's racial strife and division in the United States in the political context. But sometimes when I've given versions of this talk before, many in the audience or in America actually are quite surprised at the level of the stark divide with respect to race and ethnicity. So here, just referring to the exit polls from 2008, we can see, looking with the red bar representing support for McCain and blue for Obama, that there was a really stark divide there, where we find most whites voting for McCain. You may or may not have known this, but of course Obama won in 08, but he didn't win with the majority of the white vote. And with almost unanimous support among African Americans for the Democratic candidate. Now, before you start to think, well, yeah, blacks voted for the black candidate, you should know that that number would be roughly the same if you went to 2004 and looked at John Kerry, or you went back to 2000 and looked at Al Gore. African Americans have given roughly 85 to 95% of their vote to the Democratic candidate in every presidential election since Lyndon Johnson. And it's worth noting that whites have, the majority of whites have supported the Republican presidential candidate in every presidential election since Lyndon Johnson in 1964. So no Democratic candidate, not Bill Clinton, not Jimmy Carter, not Barack Obama, not anybody. No Democratic candidates got a majority of the white vote since Lyndon Johnson. It's a very divided electorate. That's the takeaway message from this particular slide, if you didn't already know that. All right, moving forward here, I want to just highlight a couple of points that set the stage for a research project. The first is that there is really no doubt that Obama, although he won in 2008, and of course again in 2012, he lost some fraction of the vote as a consequence of his race and of his race alone. Some of my own work has demonstrated that, but a number of scholars using a number of different methodologies have essentially arrived at that same conclusion. The kind of consensus seems to be that about 5% of the popular vote was lost to Obama as a consequence of his racial background and his racial background alone. Basically, racial animus undercut his support by about 5%. He did win both at the popular vote and the more technically necessary electoral vote, but he would have been flirting with landslide type numbers had he not been black. Now, one manifestation of this racial penalty that we make reference to here in the slide gets back to what I started with, the notion that Obama is a Muslim or that he is not a citizen of the United States. It turns out that other researchers demonstrated that racially prejudiced attitudes are correlated with these beliefs. So we're not the first set of scholars to make this connection. But what we are doing that's different than what previous scholars have done, we think, is that we're less interested in explaining why people think Obama is a Muslim or why people think Obama is a non-citizen. We're actually more interested in thinking why more people didn't think that. Why wasn't this more universally embraced? What was it about the campaign that allowed Obama to keep those attitudes under control such that he would be victorious in 2008 and then again in 2012? So we were coming at this from a somewhat different perspective than previous researchers. We want to know, what was it that the Obama campaign did to try to manage these negative rumors? Again, he got 43% of the white vote in 2008, which is actually comparable to the fraction of the vote that John Kerry, the previous Democratic presidential candidate, or Bill Clinton or Al Gore received. It was roughly in the same territory. So he did okay. He kept it about where he needed to keep it. All right. So the question, I guess, before you now is, what role did race play in helping to promote these rumors? And some of this I've already talked about. We know that the embracing of these rumors was in part motivated by racial animus. Not only racial animus, but one of the factors that contributed was racial prejudice, or the racial resentment scale. It's kind of a modern, more sophisticated measure of prejudice, according to at least some scholars. We also know that from other research that Obama is less likely to be viewed as American. This is some work in social psychology. It's interesting, this particular project I'm referring to on screen here, has found that Obama is less likely to be viewed as American relative to comparable candidates like Hillary Clinton, but even less likely to be viewed as American compared to Tony Blair, who, as you may know, is not American. So, now what's going on there? Tony Blair does share one characteristic in common with Hillary Clinton. It's not his nationality, but it is his race. And Obama does not share that characteristic. So that's what one finding has emerged. The other is that the link between these racial considerations and these rumors, the fact that perceptions about Obama's citizenship status and his religion, we argue that it sets up a kind of a perverse incentive structure in the sense that it encourages politicians, to the extent that they recognize this connection, to try to exploit it. In other words, some politicians have an incentive to exacerbate considerations about race and thereby exacerbate these negative rumors, and other politicians have an incentive to try to de-emphasize race for the very same reasons, because it would help to de-emphasize some of these negative considerations about the candidacy of Barack Obama. In short, if race is a kind of an accelerant in the kind of notion that Obama was not born in the U.S. and is a foreigner, is in both in terms of citizenship and religion, then race can also be utilized to kind of diminish, to undermine these perceptions. And we believe that the Obama campaign relied on this very strategy, as we'll hopefully demonstrate this afternoon. All right. We develop a particular theory in this project that we refer to with the colorful name of whitewashing. But the basic idea here is that, and I should say too, as I move forward, that this theory is not simply defined by the candidacy of Barack Obama. Actually, we're just using his candidacy to help illustrate it, but we think it applies to the whole kind of category of politicians. In any case, this idea of whitewashing notes the idea that candidates try to convey in various symbolic gestures, implicit kinds of actions, and in some cases explicit actions, suggesting that their sympathies, their loyalties lie argue that indeed most Americans probably know, but reminding people can sometimes have an effect. It was done in order to convey information about where his racial sympathies might lie and where they might not lie, by making reference to this fact. We argue that he also emphasized his upbringing with respect to his grandparents and his mother raised, and his father was for the most part not a factor in his upbringing. That his grandparents were from the Midwest, the solid, virtuous Midwest, and they have appropriate values which they passed on to their grandson, Barack Obama. He also avoided, we would argue, the discussion of racial issues and being aligned with the kind of traditional stereotypes of black, liberal, democratic political candidates, which is that they are motivated by a concern of addressing racial inequities. He wanted to not play into that particular perception, so he generated and developed a campaign that would send out different kinds of messages. So we argue. And we also make the case here that this whitewashing appeal will be especially attractive to Republican voters. It will be especially attractive to Republican voters. Why is that the case? Basically, as I've indicated in my comments already, we've got a very racially divided party system in the United States, in part because of what might be called sorting, or the movement of people from one party when they find that its policies are no longer acceptable to another. Over the course of several decades since the civil rights movement in the 1960s in the U.S., increasingly racially conservative individuals have adopted a Republican Party identification, and racially liberal individuals, if they were previously Republicans, and there were plenty of those back in the 60s and 70s, have moved into the Democratic Party or remained in the Democratic Party. Now, I was careful to use the phrase racially conservative here, because I mean that these individuals are conservative on various policies designed to address racial inequity. I'm not necessarily making the case about their being racially intolerant or racially prejudiced or racist, but I am making the case about them being racially conservative. In some cases, they are those other things as well, but I'm not making the case that they're necessarily interchangeable or one and the same. Okay. The other reason why we think that Republicans should be especially receptive to this strategy is that almost no Democrats embraced the idea. They had no electoral or political incentive to do so. This notion that Obama was born outside the U.S. or that he was a Muslim. So for the most part, this strategy would tamp down negative kind of perceptions among Republicans, kind of help to demobilize that group, and possibly even convert some of those individuals as well. More formally here, in terms of hypotheses, really I guess there are a couple that I want to highlight. The first is that we argue that the Obama campaign sought to appeal to white voters in order to combat this notion he was foreign, and to combat this notion that he was a traditional African-American candidate primarily interested in addressing racial inequality and the racial hierarchy in the U.S. So we think that the Obama campaign tried to undercut that impression by overemphasizing his white supporters, that the whites who thought that he was an acceptable candidate, and which is kind of represented by this photo. And the second photo here, which is of course a picture of Obama as a child with his mother. We think that the Obama campaign also wanted to make sure that voters knew that in fact he was the product of a mixed, racially mixed marriage, that in fact his mother was white. He wanted to highlight his particular ancestry, and he wanted to highlight those individuals who were most inclined to support him. And these were done in order to send a kind of a singular message. I'm a different black candidate. I'm not a black candidate concerned with black issues. I'm a candidate concerned with your issues, which is a way of saying I'm a candidate concerned with white issues and protecting white interests. And the point I made earlier here is regarding the individuals who should be most receptive to this appeal, and that would be, we would argue, Republicans, for all the reasons I've already gone over. All right, so far so good. So now a little bit here about the evidence we marshaled to provide some support for this point of view. There are actually 4 data sets that we rely upon here. I'm going to go over it relatively quickly, but I can either address this more quickly or more in depth now, or in Q&A if you're so inclined. The first thing we do is we examine the scope of this strategy, the extent to which it was actually employed. So we look at, we did a content analysis of political ads that were run in 2008 by Barack Obama or by his Republican opponent, John McCain. The idea here was to see how frequently the candidates emphasized individuals in their ads who belong to particular racial groups. If we're right, then the Obama campaign should overemphasize whites relative, say, to John McCain, and the Obama campaign should overemphasize whites relative to their actual fraction in the electorate. Whites make up about 74%, 75% of the presidential electorate in terms of voters, at least in 2008. That number is diminishing rapidly over time, but in 08 it was about almost 75%. In terms of the entire country, whites represent a little less than 2/3 of the fraction. And by whites here, I mean non-Hispanic whites represent about 65% of the population. We expect Obama to overemphasize that, and McCain, relative to what the actual numbers are that I just indicated, and also relative to John McCain. Now, before I go on, let me just say this too. Without our particular framework being imposed on this data, the expectation might be the exact reverse. That is to say, the Democratic Party represents a more ethnically and racially diverse coalition than the Republican Party, which is a largely white constituency in terms of the voters, like 90% or some odd percentage number. So one might have expected the Republicans to have the more whiter kind of campaign ads than the Democrats, but we actually expect the reverse for reasons we've indicated. All right, the second component is this ad, which I'll show you in a moment. It's an ad entitled "The Country I Love." It's a Barack Obama ad from 2008, designed to introduce the candidate to the electorate. He was relatively unknown at that point. Admittedly, he had just bested the former First Lady in the Democratic primaries, but most Americans are not Democrats. Or at least did not vote in the primary. So for many Americans in the run-up to the general election, this was the first ad, actually was the very first ad that the Obama campaign released once they had secured the nomination. We manipulate the racial imagery in that ad in order to provide variation on this whitewashing theme that we've introduced here this afternoon. The extent to which appeals, visual, symbolic appeals are made to whites, and whether or not that would make a difference. We argue that it will. This long acronym here is just a reference to what Patrick talked about earlier in terms of election studies. The ANES, the American National Election Study, if you're not familiar with it, and the EGSS is just a particular variant of that larger project, the Evaluations of Government and Society Study. Two surveys that were done, well, this particular survey, EGSS, and then this second one here below, are studies that allow us to examine with observational data whether or not variation in the kinds of things I'm talking about this afternoon, perceptions about the candidate's race, and perceptions about the candidate's racial favoritism, whether or not that had implications for whether people thought he was a Muslim and whether they thought he was going outside the U.S. So these are the kind of data sets we rely upon this afternoon. All right, so hopefully not going too fast here. But please do let me know if there are any questions or confusion. Okay, so the first thing I want to show you is from this content analysis that I just made reference to. Again, what we looked at were, and I think this was indicated on the previous slide, a random sample of 20 Obama ads from 2008 and a random sample of 20 McCain ads from 2008 to see, and then we just had our undergraduates who didn't know our overarching hypotheses just go in, look at those ads, and just count up the number of white faces relative to faces that were shown in the ad overall, excluding the candidates. And here I'm just going to show you the fraction of each group who were white. In the McCain ad, roughly 67% of the faces in the ad were whites or apparently white. And the Obama ad is about 92%. So let me just revisit some of these numbers I've already given you. The American population is about 66-65% non-Hispanic white. So McCain almost hit it right on the nose. He was mostly showing the country as it actually is. Obama is far out of proportion to the fraction of whites in the American population and in the American electorate. So relative to the population of voters, relative to the population of citizens, and relative to John McCain, Barack Obama was showing a lot more whites in his ads, which seems kind of strange because most whites aren't Democrats. They're actually Republicans. I'm not going to show you this afternoon, but I do have later slides I could show. We also looked at the percentage of blacks, and it's just a mirror image of this. McCain showed more blacks in his ads, and non-whites in general, than did Obama.
I'm Barack Obama. America as a country is...
Let me set this up before I show that. That particular ad, there we go, is this Country I Love ad that I made reference to again. It's the campaign ad that launched the general election campaign of Barack Obama in 2008. It's a fairly innocuous ad. It's a biographical ad that talks about where he grew up, what his values are, etc. And the version I believe I'm going to show you first is a version that has been altered only in one way. We have taken out images that the candidate has of his mother and his grandparents. There's about 3 or 4 images that make reference visually to his mother or his grandparents. In all other respects, we have done nothing to the ad. So the narration in the ad is unaltered. And I want you to pay attention to the narration because there are a number of code words that Barack Obama actually uses that have racial implications in the American political context. References to hardworking Americans, because we all know who they are. References to work ethic. References to moving people from welfare to work. All these are carefully chosen phrases that are meant to convey a certain kind of point of view. But we don't even alter those. Those are kept constant across conditions. So this is a very conservative test. We've got the same verbiage in each of the versions of the ad, because I'll show you the altered ad and then I'll show you the original ad. At least I think that's the order it is. Maybe it's the original altered. I'm not sure yet, but we'll see in a moment. In any case, the narration is not modified in any way. The narration, the point I'm making is simply that the narration itself is infused with racial content. Implicit racial content, but racial nonetheless. The only thing we did is we would just remove the images. All right.
I'm Barack Obama. America as a country is strong families and strong values. My life's been blessed by both. I was raised by a single mom and my grandparents. We didn't have much money, but they taught me values straight from the Kansas heartland where they grew up. Accountability and self-reliance, love of country, working hard without making excuses, treating your neighbor as you'd like to be treated. It's what guided me as I worked my way up, taking jobs and loans to make it through college. It's what led me to pass up Wall Street jobs and go to Chicago instead, helping neighborhoods devastated when steel plants closed. That's why I passed laws moving people from welfare to work, cut taxes for working families, extended health care for wounded troops who've been neglected. I approve this message because I'll never forget those values. And if I have the honor of taking the oath of office as president, it will be with a deep and abiding faith in the country I love.
All right, so that's in many respects an innocuous ad. It is a plausible ad that he could have run. It's actually not the one that he did run because it's been modified, but he could have run that and no one would have thought it was unusual. And again, you will have noted the hopefully kind of racially charged phrases with respect to work ethic, working families, etc., and welfare. So now what I'm going to show you is the original ad, and here you'll note the differences between the ad you just saw. And in particular, the differences with respect to the visual references to his mother and his grandparents.
I'm Barack Obama. America is a country of strong families and strong values. My life's been blessed by both. I was raised by a single mom and my grandparents. We didn't have much money, but they taught me values straight from the Kansas heartland where they grew up. Accountability and self-reliance, love of country, working hard without making excuses, treating your neighbor as you'd like to be treated. It's what guided me as I worked my way up, taking jobs and loans to make it through college. It's what led me to pass up Wall Street jobs and go to Chicago instead, helping neighborhoods devastated when steel plants closed. That's why I passed laws moving people from welfare to work, cut taxes for working families, extended health care for wounded troops who've been neglected. I approve this message because I'll never forget those values. And if I have the honor of taking the oath of office as president, it will be with a deep and abiding faith in the country I love.
All right, so you saw the differences, hopefully. I'll bet most of you don't know what John McCain's mother looks like, or John Kerry's, or I could name a whole range of people. But Obama made sure that you knew what his mother looked like. And the point here is that we expect differences with respect to the extent that people embrace these rumors after exposure to the first version as opposed to the second version of these political ads. All right, so let's take a look at the results here. So what I'm about to show you is simply, the dependent variable here is simply the extent to which the participants in our experiment, it's based on a convenient sample, but nonetheless we have random assignment so we can make strong claims about causality. The extent to which the participants in our study believe that Obama was born outside of the US. The results here are actually derived from a regression where we've controlled for various demographic qualities as well, but the results are unaltered if we control for such things or if we don't. These results are fairly solid. And we look at them differently by the party of the participants as well. Last thing I should say here is that we're only focusing on whites who participated in our study because, of course, our theory here is primarily about appeals to whites and how they would respond. All right, so the first version here, of course, is the what we're calling the race-neutral ad. It's actually the doctored ad, but it's an ad that's a plausible ad. And what we find here is that a non-trivial fraction, everything's coded on a 0 to 1 scale, by the way, meaning that roughly 18% of Republicans indicate that they think Obama not merely probably was born outside the U.S., but was unequivocally born outside of the U.S., 18%. That's what they think when they see an ad that does not show his white grandparents and that does not show his white mother. When they do see those images, however, we find significant differences here emerging. Now, this slide does not allow us to get into the head of Barack Obama or to get into the head of his campaign organizers. So we can't say definitively why they did it, but we can say that it had an effect, and the effect is the one consistent with our theory. We also can say how they orchestrated their campaign ads more generally, which we discussed in our content analysis, which provides some sense about their motives. In any case, you can see the effects here we think are fairly dramatic. With respect now to the issue of whether or not Obama is secretly a Muslim, or maybe not even secretly, we find comparable results. With the doctored version of the ad, a non-trivial fraction of Republicans think that Obama is a Muslim. With the original version of the ad, they're far less likely to think so. So these are, I should underscore that in addition to the fact that we only changed those 3 or 4 images, we ran our experiment in 2011 when Obama had already served a couple of years as president. So we made it all the harder for us to find a result. We weren't running this on an unknown quantity. We're running it regarding the President of the United States, and these are the results we are achieving. All right, so there's more. So we've demonstrated with experimental data, and we've demonstrated with content analysis data that there is a racial strategy underlying efforts on the part of the Obama administration to kind of make the case for his candidacy. What about observational data? None of the data that I've presented so far is actually nationally representative, but we're going to speak to that. So just by way of recap, in the experiment, we manipulated the race of Obama, or at least information about his racial background, and we manipulated information about the race of his supporters. In the observational data, we try to approximate this in a couple of ways. We tried to get variation on perceptions of Obama's race, whether he is viewed as African American or not. Turns out there's a lot of variation on that. And perceptions about whether Obama is biased towards blacks, or in other words, biased against whites. Turns out there's some variation on that as well. What's our expectation? Our expectation is that people who believe that Obama is black, or people who believe that he is biased in favor of blacks, should be more likely to think that he is a Muslim, or that he is a non-citizen. Now you might think, as a factual matter, Obama actually is black. So how could it be that belief that he is an African American is somehow connected to these attitudes? Stay tuned. It's also worth noting that we expect these results to be more stark among Republicans in our sample. Samples, plural, actually. All right, so how do we measure this notion about Obama's race? We actually had a question in the ANES and the internet sample that we collected that read as follows. How would you describe Barack Obama's race? Mark all that apply. White, black, Hispanic, mixed race, Asian, or other race. Almost no one indicated Asian or other race, as it turns out. Indeed, almost no one indicated white. The results are all basically either in the mixed race category or in the black category. Turns out that among white respondents in this survey, 32% indicated black and 72% indicated mixed race. So the first black president is actually not regarded as black by most whites in our country. Now, again, they had the option of marking all that apply. So they could have marked black and white or black and mixed race. But almost only a third of the sample marked black at all. And the vast majority, the overwhelming majority, marked mixed race, for what it's worth. Anyway, what's more relevant for our purposes is whether or not the people who thought he was black, whether they thought he was black in addition to something else or simply black alone. Whether they would be more inclined to think that he is a Muslim. Turns out that they were. Now, Republicans are more inclined to think it in any case, but they're significantly more likely to think that he is a Muslim if they also think that he is black. This result is not just based on the raw data, by the way. We've controlled in these analyses. These are just breaking down, for purposes of illustration, regressions wherein we control for all the demographic qualities that you should control for, gender, age, etc. We've also controlled for the racial resentment scale. So we're incorporating racial conservatism or even racial animus. But simply asking whether or not the respondent thought Obama was black is sufficient to provide at least some leverage on whether or not they also think he's a Muslim, which on its face doesn't make much sense, but actually makes a lot of sense from the perspective of our theory. All right. Well, this question is actually titled wrong, the slide, but actually what we're getting at here is not about perceptions of his race, but his racial favoritism, which is embedded in this question here. So we asked our respondents, do the policies of the Obama administration favor whites over blacks, favor blacks over whites, or do they treat both groups the same? And the expectation, of course, again, is that respondents who think that Obama favors blacks over whites are going to be more inclined to think that he is a Muslim or born outside the U.S. By the way, in the previous set of results, I only talked about the Muslim question and not the citizenship question because we didn't have a question on citizenship in that particular study. Just by way of numbers, if you're interested, the vast majority of people in the study, the whites and non-whites, thought that he treated both groups the same. But I believe about 25% or so of the sample thought that he favored blacks over whites, and virtually none thought that he favored whites over blacks, which is ironic, actually. In any case, here, if you can see the top of that slide, here's what we basically find in terms of results with respect to being whether or not Obama is born outside the U.S. based on this perception of racial favoritism. When there is no perception of racial favoritism, basically people who think, the vast majority of whom agree with this, that he treats both groups the same. There is more of a tendency for Republicans to think that he favors blacks over whites, but that tendency is greater if they believe that he favors, if he is showing racial favoritism. Now, it's worth noting that this part here is not consistent with our expectations. Turns out Democrats who think that Obama shows racial favoritism are also likely to think that he is a non-citizen. The only point I want to drive home here is that approximately 28% of white Republicans believe that Obama is showing favoritism to blacks over whites. But among Democrats, only 5% believe that. So whereas the slopes are roughly equivalent, if anything, it's actually sharper among Democrats here in terms of the change from the two categories, very few Democrats actually fall into the category of thinking that he shows racial favoritism. Okay. And with respect to the issue regarding his religion, we get comparable results here. We don't find anything going on with the Democrats, but we do find something occurring with respect to the Republicans. In effect, if they think that he favors blacks over whites, and again, I should underscore that this is even after controlling for racial resentment attitudes or broader measures of racial intolerance. Even after taking that into account, we're finding this effect with respect to perceptions of racial favoritism and its connection to the belief that Obama is a Muslim. All right, so by way of conclusion, actually, this is the slide I'll end on. I have some additional slides that I could show, perhaps in answer to questions, but I want to get to Q&A as rapidly as possible here. In conclusion, there are a couple things I want to highlight. First, there's a lot of literature in political science, at least in the corner of political science that I inhabit, that talks about the incentive and the actual behavior of candidates to play on the racial antipathies of Americans in order to gain electoral advantage. And oftentimes the argument is that members of one party are more inclined to do that than members of another party. In the American context, Republicans more so than Democrats. The case we're making with this project is that both parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, have incentives to make racial appeals. They have incentives to make racial appeals because the American electorate, for the most part, is racially conservative. Again, I'm using that phrase purposefully as opposed to some more charged label because there's considerable evidence that it's true. Americans don't like policies designed to address racial inequality. They oppose them for the most part, particularly among whites. Nevertheless, although the Republicans have an incentive to inflame those attitudes, Democrats have an incentive to tamp them down. Or in other words, Republicans have an incentive to link Democratic objectives to disfavored minorities like blacks and Hispanics, and Democrats have an incentive to dislink themselves from disfavored minorities like blacks and Hispanics, to engage in whitewashing in order to convey the image that they're a different kind of Democrat. Barack Obama is not the first person to do this. He will not be the last. One does not have to be a racial minority to have such an incentive. Indeed, I could have given much of this talk this afternoon, swapped out the name Barack Obama, swapped in the name Bill Clinton, and almost made the same presentation because Bill Clinton did much of the same thing. Democrats do this because they have an incentive to do it, even as they criticize Republicans for playing to those same racial antipathies. We think in our project that we have demonstrated that Obama highlighted his white ancestry and his white support, and he did so, I think I spelled that wrong, he did so in order to diffuse or to undercut support for this notion that he was foreign, this notion that he was somehow obligated or intending to pursue governing from the vantage point of African Americans, but not from the vantage point of whites in general. So that's what we argued he did. We argued that this strategy was especially effective among Republicans, in part because individuals most interested in the message that was sent have already self-selected into the Republican Party. And the last point I want to leave you with here is that it's a different narrative, a different kind of takeaway message than the feel-good message we all got from 2008. If a black candidate, I ask, can successfully appeal to racial intolerance in order to achieve electoral victory, does that really represent racial progress? I have an answer for that, but I'll resist the urge to tell you right now. Thank you very much. Yes.
Very interesting talk. Thank you very much. I have two questions. The first one, do you think your results would remain the same if you had, let's say, a Hispanic Republican candidate instead of a black Democrat candidate?
That's interesting. If oh, wait, I'm sorry.
Okay, and then the second question is, have you looked at the women in your sample? Because Obama as a white mother, is it possible there's a gender difference in the reaction to the signal, especially in the experiment among Republican women relative to Republican men?
We did look at women. I'll answer the second question first. We did look at women in our experiment. We did not find any gender differences. We did look at gender in controlling for partisanship, in part because we didn't have enough cases to see if that were there. Some of my other work has demonstrated that there are gender, racial dynamics in the U.S. do have gender implications. So I actually might have expected, and might expect there to be gender implications to some of the results I showed here. But unfortunately, the data we collected don't allow us, we don't have sufficient power to pursue that. Your first question was about
An Hispanic.
yes, a Hispanic Republican. The thing is that, so I do think that other groups, non-black politicians, can have an incentive to engage in comparable kinds of behavior. Now, Republicans, because they have a kind of an opposite image, party image relative to Democrats, they actually have, they don't have an incentive to try to diminish the extent to which they're associated with racial minorities. Their stereotype is that they're already not associated with racial minorities. So African Americans or Hispanics or Asian Americans or Muslim Americans or whatever, any kind of visible racial minority associated with the Republican Party, those individuals kind of have a pass. There's less of a sense that these individuals are going to govern on behalf of their minority group because they are members of the party that doesn't represent minorities. So they don't have to worry about that. Now, a Hispanic Democrat would in fact have these same concerns as would a white Democrat, although a little different, but not that much different. So anyway, that's hopefully answers your question. Yes, sir.
I also have two questions, but I'll be polite and ask one. I'll ask the second later. It's about your selection of campaign ads.
Mm-hmm.
20 Obama ads and 20 campaign ads. These were ads produced by the campaigns themselves?
Yes.
Okay, so you didn't look at campaigns produced by third parties?
No.
Or PACs?
No.
Okay, and because I'm wondering if the dynamics might be considerably different. I'm thinking in particular of the other kind of famous racially charged ad, the
Willie Horton.
Willie Horton ad, which was of course not produced by the Bush campaign. It wasn't widely shown until it was picked up.
Well, so just quickly, the Willie Horton ad, for those who may not be familiar with that, this is an ad that was run in the 1988 general election in the American presidential contest. And it was an ad on behalf of then Vice President George H.W. Bush, which made the case that his opponent, Michael Dukakis, was soft on crime. And it made that case about him being soft on crime by providing an example about a convict who, on what's called a weekend furlough, was let loose and engaged in some additional acts of chaos. But as it turns out, that particular convict, whose name was William Horton, but the people who did the ad thought Willie sounded better. So Willie Horton was an African American, and they made sure you knew that because they showed a picture of him in the ad. And the couple that he assaulted were white. Okay, so the question is, and of course that was associated not with the Bush 1988 campaign, but with an outside group. As it turns out, actually, the Bush campaign was associated with it, so in a way, maybe this answers your question. We're talking, I know, not less about my particular presentation, more about that particular historical event, but other historians and social scientists have demonstrated that the Bush campaign put that ad out there, but they wanted to have plausible deniability. And so they allowed for this ostensibly third party to engage in it. Lee Atwater, who was the mentor of Karl Rove, who's probably more familiar to most of you in this room, Lee Atwater on his deathbed apologized for that appeal. So the notion that the Bush campaign wasn't responsible for it is just actually not true. If we were to look at third party candidates as opposed to the ads sponsored by the candidates themselves, my suspicion is that they wouldn't be all that different. Because the people working on behalf of the candidates, even if they're not officially connected to them, have the same sets of incentives that the candidates have. Yes, front Greg.
Can you talk a little bit more about the content analysis methodology you employ? So you ask your students to look at these ads, so they were ads like in newspapers, on televisions, on YouTube, and you ask them to count the overall number of people that appear in the set, and then you ask them to count the number of whites versus the number of blacks. So that's the way you proceeded.
Yeah, it's essentially like that. You're right for more detail. So, question, of course, is about the methods we use for the content analysis. We went to a website, actually at Stanford University. You can go there, and they archive almost all, if not literally all, of the ads that were run in various contests. In this case, the 2008 presidential contest. And of that larger number of ads, we just randomly selected 20 from each group. And then we had our coders, we had 2 of them, just go through each frame of the ad and count the number of visibly identifiable faces, excluding crowd scenes from which you can't really discern, and count the number and then the racial background, white, black, Hispanic, Arab, whatever. And then calculate a percentage, and that's all we did. So nothing terribly complicated.
I think it's more easy when you ask them to identify blacks versus whites than when you ask to identify Hispanics or Arabs. Maybe there is some personal judgment involved.
Yeah, that's true. That's a fair point. I mean, I think that because Hispanics and whites are sometimes phenotypically indistinguishable, it might be more difficult. We did have them do that as well. But what that would mean is that it would be, in effect, more difficult to identify whites because whites could be Arabs or could be Hispanics. So we may well be undercounting whites. And yet we still got the results we got. So that ambiguity that you referred to doesn't make it easier for us to find what we're looking for. It makes it harder. Yeah, in the back. Yes, you, sir.
I have a question for you. You said you controlled for many different things. One control that comes to my mind would be political knowledge, general measure political knowledge. Did you control for any of that? I mean, I don't suspect it would change much of your result, but is there something you did control for?
Yeah, that's a good question, whether we control for political knowledge. And the answer is we did. I may not have mentioned that in my quick run through of the analysis. So just to be clear, for the experiment, we did not control for political knowledge because we didn't actually measure it. We did control for education, which admittedly is not the same thing, but it's at least a acceptable proxy, or at least some would argue it's an acceptable proxy. But with the survey data, the American National Election Study data, we did have a political knowledge measure, and we did control for it. And not surprisingly, if you're wondering, people who have higher levels of political knowledge are less likely to say Obama is a Muslim or was born outside the U.S. But even controlling for that, we still get the results that we get. Yes?
So I wanted to follow up about the context analysis. And if I'm understanding your general argument, it's that it's not just because Obama is perceived as black that he is whitewashing his ads, that it's a general tendency among Democrats more generally. And I'm wondering if you looked at other candidates, because the argument you were putting forward was that the percentages portrayed in McCain's ad were comparable to the population. And I'm wondering if you count Obama as a black in his ad, that changes the dynamics completely for him. So you want too many black faces in the ad, and there's already one. I can understand that logic going on there, but for Clinton, for example,
Yeah.
if he has a completely white ad, it would be a different dynamic. The perception would play differently, especially critiques from within his own party. So I'm wondering if you think that kind of whitewashing in the ad front would play out similarly for white candidates among Democrats who have a similar strategic considerations.
I think that that's a good point, actually, when I've given this talk before someone else has mentioned this. I think in retrospect, the paper is actually under review now, so depending on what reviewers say, we may be forced to do this. But in retrospect, we probably also should have looked at the most recent presidential contest prior to 08, which would be 04, and see how John Kerry and George W. Bush did their ads. But I can tell you what we would theorize. I can't tell you what we would find because we haven't looked. But we would expect the basic distribution of racial imagery in the John Kerry ads in 2004 to mostly map on to what Obama's doing. Obama would have some additional incentives because, as you say, he's black. But the Democratic Party is perceived by many whites in America as the party of racial minorities and of blacks. So a John Kerry candidacy or a Bill Clinton candidacy or an Al Gore candidacy, they need to also make clear, to the extent that they want to appeal to that constituency in the United States, they also need to make clear that that's not them, that they're different. So they also have an incentive to kind of whitewash their appeals. And although we didn't look at the ads, we do make reference in the paper that we've written about the many ways in which Bill Clinton engaged in this similar kinds of racial imagery. This Sister Souljah episode, which is an obscure event, kind of on the line of Willie Horton. But essentially, Bill Clinton was looking for opportunities to demonstrate that he was not a traditional racial liberal, and he found such episodes in his 1992 campaign on a whole range of different dimensions in terms of making sure he oversaw the execution of a black death row prisoner in Arkansas, going back and making sure he was there for that, posing for images at correctional facilities in front of black inmates. I mean, Democrats do this sort of thing all the time, and they do it for reasons I think we've tried to isolate here in this project. Yes, you haven't spoken yet.
Yeah, I can follow up the analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in light of your theory of framework and your words related to party strategy, well, since your argument is on party strategy, don't you think it would be better to do your content analysis on the top 20 viewed ads instead of a random sample? Because I can understand all the advantages of a random sample, but since it is related to party strategy, it would be useful to use the top 20 viewed, or at least the 20 ads that the party wanted to be the most viewed by the Americans.
Yeah, that's a fair question. And I guess there is a case for doing exactly what you suggested. I'm not, as you were asking the question, I was trying to think how we would do that. I mean, I guess you could look at the ads to the extent that we have information about the media markets in which an ad was run. We could therefore extrapolate about the size of the media market and therefore about the importance of the ad. Or we could look at the timing of the ad when it was released on the presumption that, I'm not sure what the presumption would be. Earlier ads are more important, or maybe you can make a case that later ads are more important. I'm not sure. We could do that. We have not done that. It is worth noting, by the way, that the Country I Love ad that we had in our experiment was the kickoff ad of the campaign. So that at least anecdotally provides some indication that the Obama campaign thought that was the most important ad to begin with. This is the ad that's going to help frame images of the candidate going forward, and that ad had the qualities that I've described this afternoon. So that's only a half-hearted response to your question, but it's the best I can do. Yes.
The Country I Love ad seems to me a little bit ambiguous in terms of racial cues or ideological cues or even regional cues. A lot of the cues that are going to be racial, I would say, are simply for specific states or specific groups in specific states. Do you know if there were ads by the Obama campaign that were more, the cues are more clear, just like the examples of you gave?
I see. Yeah, I mean, you could make a case that the visual and even the verbal cues in the Country I Love ad were what we would call implicit, implicit in the sense that there were no racial nouns used, and the visual imagery, I've attributed a meaning to them in this talk this afternoon, but of course you're free to reject that attribution. In other work that I've done and that other scholars have done as well, we've made the case that these more implicit strategies are adopted purposefully precisely because they allow for this plausible deniability. So you might say, well, then how do we know? How do we know that it's really what you say? Well, as it turns out, there are, again, a number of studies have been run showing that exposure to these implicit appeals, references to hardworking Americans, working without making excuses, this kind of phraseology has been shown in other work that I and others have done to, in fact, generate racial effects. So again, we can't know what the rationale, we can't get into the head of the sponsors of the ad to know precisely why they did it, but we can in fact make hard and fast claims about what the effect is of exposure to these appeals, and I can tell you that it is in fact racial, because it does activate racial attitudes, the very phrases that I made reference to, and the very images that I made reference to, not from this particular project, but from other studies. So that's at least a half, that should at least hopefully provide you with some comfort that these are not frivolous kind of claims I'm making. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have a comment and a question. First comment, it doesn't seem surprising to me that the Democrats would focus so much on whites in their ads. It's because, you showed us data on voting in the U.S. and you see blacks overwhelmingly vote Democratic and whites. The white electorate seems more competitive, so there are more votes to be won among whites. So it just seems like a normal thing. It's probably in the ad, some of the things aren't necessarily related to race and other regional or other things. They're just the Democrats are just trying to appeal to groups and regions that are more competitive, where their votes to be won. I'm not sure it's exactly. I'm not sure whitewashing is the appropriate term. I'm not sure all racial or other things there. Just basically trying to appeal to voters who might actually switch parties. And the other thing is, that leads to the question, did this actually have an effect in terms of votes? So you show that in terms of believing these rumors that it did reduce the number who believed them, but did it actually switch any votes?
Yes.
Yeah, did you look into that?
I'll answer the second part first. The first part of your question, actually the second part of the first part of your question doesn't seem to comport with the first part of that question. You start out by saying, well, yeah, they are appealing to whites. It's rational that they're doing so. And then you say, but it's not really racial. Well,
I mean, some of it might not be really racial. I'm saying just in general, trying to appeal to competitive groups
who are racially identified.
I mean, racially, yes. Part of it is racial.
Well, I'm arguing that it's mostly racial because indeed they're appealing to racially identified constituencies because of the racially divided electorate that they confront. So to say that, well, it's not really about race, it's about something else. I have evidence that it's about race. I don't think you have any evidence that it's not about, that it's about something else. But if you do, I'd be happy to hear.
My point is more that it just seems it's not surprising that they focus on groups who are more competitive, where there's more a greater chance of winning votes. Whereas it wouldn't make any sense to focus on blacks because they're blacks.
That may well be, but they're not merely focusing on whites as a group, but they're focusing on racially intolerant whites by fashioning appeals that would be most appreciated by racially intolerant or conservative whites. So it's about race and it's about the racial content of the message, all of which makes it harder to make the case that it's not about race, because it's about race in at least two ways. And the second question you had was about the impact on vote choice. Yes. In the paper that I don't think I provided, we also do look at vote choice as well. We find in the experimental context that emphasizing the white supporters of Obama does in fact make people more likely to approve of his performance. Remember, we ran those ads in 2011. We ran the experiment in 2011. So I guess we could have asked about vote choice, but there was no election at the time, so it wouldn't have made much sense. But we did have asked about presidential approval, and it does have an impact. Turns out that the original version of the ad, where, well, let me make sure I'm being clear here. I showed you an altered version of the ad, and I showed you the original ad, but we actually had two other versions in the paper, which I glossed over for the presentation this afternoon. We had a version where we had only African Americans in the background, And then we had a version where we removed the white family members, but we kept the white supporters. Okay. In that latter version, we found that white Republicans had a higher approval rating of Obama than they did in the so-called race-neutral version. And so you might wonder, well, what about the version where they had his white family members too? That actually didn't generate an effect with respect to approval. We're not entirely sure, but we think it may be that even as that ad made people less likely to think he was foreign, some Republicans had a negative reaction because of the interracial marriage that Obama is the product of. They found that less acceptable. Now, that's speculation. I don't know that. But there is survey evidence indicating that Republicans are less supportive of interracial marriage than are Democrats, so that's at least plausible. And in the context of the observational data, we didn't look at vote choice, but we do know at a minimum that there's an indirect effect because people who think Obama is a Muslim or who think he was born outside the U.S. were less likely to vote for him. And was there another part of the, there was a second part of the question, right?
Well, it's about the question was about vote choice. So Obama
okay.
would have done even worse among whites.
Yes, that would be our claim. Yes, sir.
It's a third question. There is a recent instance in Canada where a party leader had dual citizenship, French and Canadian, and had some pressure to get rid of his French citizenship because it was seen as a risk of, I guess, lack of loyalty for Canada or whatever. Though there's not the same criteria for British and Canadian citizenship, but whatever. My point is, I think in some ways your research can talk to a more comparative perspective. Do you have this ambition to generalize these findings to other contexts in the American?
Yeah, that's a fair question. Of course, as an Americanist, my level of expertise is mostly concentrated in the United States, but I do recognize that there are kind of disfavored minorities in other countries, indeed maybe every country. And so the logic of this strategy that I make reference to in this project, that my colleagues and I make reference to, should play out in comparable fashion in other circumstances to the extent that there are disfavored minorities, however they are defined, and that it maps onto the party system in that particular country. It may not, of course, and if it doesn't, then there's less incentive for this to play out the way I suggest. We certainly don't think it only applies to African Americans in the U.S., so we do think in a comparative sense it applies to other groups. And there's no reason, again, given those qualifiers I just put out there, that it shouldn't also apply to other countries, given that those qualifications that I've just mentioned are met. Yes.
Were you able to control your paper using the American National Election Study to make the difference between like the true supporters of Democratic or Republican Party versus the voters that just voted for Republican to vote against Democrat, or people that voted Democrat to vote against Republican? I know, for example, in the European election study, there are questions where they ask voters to say like how close they feel to the party they voted for, and I think it can be interesting to see that among Republican voters that feel very close to the party, if those racial, cues matter more than for Republican voters that are not very close to this party, but that just voted to vote against the Democrats.
Yeah, that's a good kind of nuanced question. So I take it to be that party affiliation or identification can play itself out at least two ways. One could be an attraction to a particular party, and another could be a kind of a revulsion or a repulsion from another out party. The way we measure it in the American National Election Study mostly captures the former and not the latter. We do have measures, I suppose, that could capture that. We have feeling thermometer items. We have measures, I believe, other measures of affect towards the party. I haven't looked at any of those, so I don't know if they would affect what we're looking at here. It's an intriguing idea, but I'd have to explore it if we have the measures, and I'm not sure if we do. So, yeah, I'm good.
Two questions. The first is, I guess, according to the theory, the Democrats are not racially conservative, and this is why you expect different things. So that's
according to our theory, the Democrats are not perceived as racially conservative.
They are not, because they react differently.
I thought you were, I took your question to be about Democratic candidates. You mean Democratic voters?
Voters.
Yes. Okay, go on.
And this is why you expect different reactions. Like that. And then this raises the question about the independence, where the independence fit into this theory. Second question, did you think about asking the Obama campaign about whether this was their intention?
Well, first question, we do have independence in our model. I believe that the effects are sometimes significant in the experimental context for the independence, kind of midway between the two partisan groups. And in the observational data, I don't know if I've looked at that, but I think sometimes I'm not sure if those effects are significant for independence. Independence, of course, as you probably know, in the American context, they're not simply between the two major parties, but they're also mostly non-political. So they're less engaged in the politics in the first place. And your second question is actually a very good question. It is one that did occur to us. As it turns out, I don't have Obama on speed dial. So my ability to speak to him or his campaign advisors is limited. But I do know that some research, for example, that was done by Martin Gillens at Princeton on this issue of welfare, where he found that there was an association between the depiction of poverty in the United States in either positive or negative light by journalists, and whether that was accompanied by photographs of African Americans or non-African Americans. And he found that when poverty was depicted more negatively, there was the larger volume of African American imagery was associated with the news story. And so he found that to be an interesting pattern, and he just went and he talked to the news editors and to ask them why they did that. And of course, they were all horrified that he pointed out this pattern, and they said, probably genuinely, that was not our intent. And I actually believe them. I think that it probably, my suspicion is that it probably played out in that instance unintentionally. It may even have played out unintentionally in the instance that I describe. I don't know. There is a literature you probably know on an implicit biases that emerge that the individual is consciously unaware of or has no control over. And I guess the nature of our theory, however, is that this is probably, although there may be an implicit component, it's probably not entirely implicit. I would love to be able to talk to the campaign advisors. I don't know how truthful they would be, but I suspect that they would not deny that such a pattern exists. They would certainly, in the past, Andre, it is the case that Democratic elites have said in public, in writing, the party has to move away from its association with blacks. So it's not like they hide this. And so it may seem surprising or disturbing or uncomfortable, but this is not a secret. So I don't know exactly why the Obama campaign did what they did, but it would be in keeping with the larger strategy of Democratic elites. I mean, the Democratic Leadership Council, for example, that Bill Clinton was associated with in the 1990s, was formed precisely in order to decouple the party from racial minorities, and they made no secret of it.
Yes, I guess I can ask my second question. I guess I agree with you, it's about race. So I'm going to ask about gender. I'm wondering if you could, if you have thought about it, if you have done similar study in terms of gender. Clearly with the Hillary Clinton campaign, primary campaign, or the Sarah Palin for the more recent campaign. Or since you saw my 1988 Willie Horton reference, I'll throw you Jersey Ferrara. 1980. I don't know if those ads are also archived or not.
That's a very good point. I haven't actually thought about not just the Ferrara, but the whole line of questioning. I mean, the logic of your question I take to be that, first of all, the Democratic Party is perceived to be the party of women, even though the advantage they have with respect to women relative to the Republican Party is far slighter than the racial disparity. In any case, but female candidates have stereotypes about them that might undermine their support. We've never had a female president of the United States. Women candidates are generally viewed stereotypically as less strong leaders, So in the kind of commander-in-chief mode, they have a disadvantage relative to a comparable male candidate. And they have they're seen as being more kind of soft, more sentimental, which are not necessarily bad things, but sometimes people think they're bad things. So what does this mean for if one were to kind of engage in a little thought experiment? I mean, presumably, female candidates like a Hillary Clinton, who ran to the right of Barack Obama when it came to foreign policy matters, and is not envisioned as a kind of a traditional feminist kind of leader. I mean, Obama criticized Hillary Clinton because Hillary Clinton supported the war in Iraq, and Obama didn't. And so my point here is simply that Hillary Clinton, has to be mindful of the stereotypes about female candidates, especially female Democratic candidates, and it is more risky for her to be anti-war than it would, or anti some particular military campaign, than it would be for a male candidate. And I would expect her, or any other prominent Democratic female candidate, to send out clear signals to the electorate that if we need to go to war, I'm happy to do it, and I won't resist the effort to do so. So I think that's a very good idea. We haven't done this in the context of gender, but I suspect we would find what I just indicated. Now, Sarah Palin's a little different in a lot of ways, but relevant for our conversation at the moment. She's different because she's a Republican, and so because she is a Republican, the stereotypes about her gender are going to be muted simply because of association with the party that is perceived as more pro-war, or at least pro-defense, let's say, than the Democratic Party is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I think Sarah Palin would be, I think, especially interesting because there were a whole set of rumors about her during the campaign.
Yes.
But I'm wondering to what extent this is about race and gender, to what extent this is about two different parties. In that Republicans do not seem to need to put out the fires out.
Well,
in other words, they're both parties are trying to expand basically into white swing voters.
Yes.
And so this kind of this sort of implicit appeals to the whitewashing or to de-feminize candidates. I'm wondering if that is something only Democrats have.
I think it is.
Because of the swing voter.
I think it is.
Demographic swing.
Well, I think it is. It is still about gender in this particular conversation and not simply party, because the parties have gender and racial images. And so it's not that the Republicans don't have to worry about stereotypes, but the ones we just mentioned. So, for example, when George W. Bush ran for president in 2000, how did he run? He ran as a compassionate conservative. I'm not the hard-edged conservative that you're thinking of. I'm a different kind of conservative. I'm compassionate. I'm not the kind of conservative who doesn't embrace racial minorities. Look, Condi Rice. Look, Colin Powell. I've got this great record with ethnic minorities. Why did he do all that? Because he belongs to a party where the image is that that's not true. So it is true that there are electorally consequential stereotypes that the Republicans have to be mindful of. It's just that they're not the same ones that the Democrats have. Yes.
Would someone have to be consciously racially conservative to be affected by this? Could someone be, if you ask someone questions about, racial issues and they're very, in favor of African Americans or any other minorities, could someone who's very positive about them also be affected by this? White races, could they be affected by the fact it adds still more white to that?
Yes, I was very careful to make the case throughout my talk that I'm not making, this is not, I don't want the takeaway message from this to be, Hutchings got up here and said they're a bunch of racists and they're responsive to blah, blah, blah. This is the first time I've actually used the term racist, or maybe the second. But I think that one does not have to be an unreconstructed bigot to be affected by the kinds of appeals that I'm talking about. And indeed, most Americans are not unreconstructed bigots, although they are racially conservative. And the aim of these appeals is not about indicating which group is inferior and which group is superior, but it is about which group on whose behalf you will govern. And that's what politics writ large in every society that I'm familiar with since the dawn of time is about. Politics is about power. Who's got it? Who's wielding it on whose behalf? And the kind of imagery that we talk about in this whitewashing strategy is about setting at ease. Because of the particular divisions in the U.S. on the context of race, candidates need to indicate where they fall with respect to that divide. Are you with us or are you against us? And so whether you would characterize people who are concerned about maintaining their position of superiority as racist, I leave that to you. That's not something that I'm doing. I don't know, is that...
Well, could this affect someone who is not racially conservative, at least consciously? Could someone have, positive attitudes towards blacks, positive opinions on issues related to, race, but at the same time be affected by the presence of whites in
but that's beyond the scope of our project. I could speculate, which is, I guess, what you're asking me to do. And I guess my answer would be yes, I think so. I think that because there's a familiarity, a familiarity with a particular approach to politics in the U.S. about how things are run. If a candidate were to come along and imply or say explicitly that they're going to do something radically different, that would make a lot of Americans uncomfortable. Even those Americans who might regard themselves and who might actually be, for most instances, racially tolerant. But so for example, the vast majority of whites oppose affirmative action policies in the United States. The vast majority of whites oppose reparations, even discussion of reparations, even the discussion of an effort to apologize for slavery and its aftermath in the United States. Wholly symbolic. They oppose those things. Now, most of those people are not, foaming at the mouth bigots, but they find it to be undesirable, offensive, whatever you want to call it. And so it's a very tiny slice of the white American population that would embrace these efforts to bring about genuine racial equality in the U.S. Not because they're, closet Klansmen and women, if there are such things, but because they would regard it as a violation or a deviation from the normal kind of operating procedures in the country. It would seriously kind of undermine business as usual in the U.S., and that's not acceptable to a lot of people. Yeah.
As you run experiments or think about running experiments with a pre-post-treatment framework, I ask because it'd be interesting to see if there's individual heterogeneity in terms of where people stand initially on racial conservatism. And you said something interesting, which was maybe there was also the effect of people seeing this interracial child and getting angry about it. Well, if people are already uncomfortable about black candidates, if they're getting even more uncomfortable, they're probably outside the zone that the Democrats are aiming for. So if your study is actually, the results are being pushed by that group in practical political terms, what are these effects? Are there any tangible effects for you?
Yeah, I take it part of your question to be about what these people were not going to be supportive of the Democrats in any case. I mean, partly campaign appeals, advertisements are about oftentimes demobilizing as much as mobilizing. So even when they don't think they can convert, if they can succeed in demobilizing, well, that's a win. I think Obama, to the extent that he was perceived as foreign, as illegitimate, it would give fuel to the other side to turn out to prevent this foreign, illegitimate candidate from running. If you take that away from them, they probably, in many cases, are not going to vote for him in any case, but they're less motivated to turn out to vote against him. And I think that that's what I think that was what their aim was. The people who thought Obama was a Muslim and who thought that he was born outside the U.S. were probably not going to be converted. I agree. But that wasn't necessarily their aim. And indeed, politicians frequently develop appeals to try to demobilize people on the other side, even if they can't convert them. Because all they need to do is get 50% plus 1. And they win.
I was struck by your comment that the black Republican candidate would not suffer.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my suggestion would be that we should do an experiment just to test that. And this again, this would mean that the Republican, the Democrat identifiers are not racially conservatives, and that's sort of a, I guess I would like to challenge that. I suppose there are some racially conservative Democrats, and that the black Republican candidate would make some gains like that.
Oh, okay. A couple of elements in the so the first part is about testing whether or not black Republicans would be immune from some of the stereotypes. I actually have a graduate student who's already written a dissertation on that, so I'm not pursuing that. But she found results consistent with this notion, which is to say that essentially what she found is that there are racial images, there are racial messages conveyed by your partisanship, conveyed by your racial demographic category, and they can amplify themselves when they go together, but one can undercut the other. So a African American Republican is not going to be presumed to be a racial liberal, precisely because he or she is a Republican. And that's not just me stating that, that's in part me referencing my former students' research project. And the other question you had was about whether, are there racially conservative or indeed even racially intolerant Democrats? Of course, the answer is yes, there are. Now, this particular project in part gave the impression that they were vanishingly small only because the nature of the dependent variable here was whether or not you thought Obama was a Muslim or born outside the US. And as it turns out, as a practical matter, Democrats had little political incentive to embrace those rumors, which of course, first of all, they're wrong, they're not true. And secondly, they had no, by dint of identifying as a Democrat, they had less of an incentive to embrace it. And even if you don't buy my reason for why that was true, as a practical matter, for whatever reason, virtually no Democrats believe that. So our ability to sway Democrats with this particular dependent variable was going to be limited because there's no variation on the dependent variables.
That's a broader question, but do you think that Obama's 6 years in office is as whitewashed as like whole strategy? I mean, you could say, you know, the ends justify the means. So what is your take?
Well, my short answer would be yes, but I guess you want a longer answer. I think that Obama has mostly governed in the same fashion that he campaigned, which is to say that he has very assiduously avoided aligning himself with issues of race and racial equity. A colleague of mine at the University of Pennsylvania in the U.S. has done a content analysis of the speeches and public pronouncements of all presidents since Dwight Eisenhower up until Barack Obama. And what he found is that that Barack Obama has talked about race as a president less frequently than any other president in that time period. So it isn't simply that he's governed in this fashion. The same incentives that would encourage him to campaign this way are the same incentives that would encourage him to govern this way. And I would argue that he has governed this way, which is not to say, it's not me here saying he's been an unmitigated failure. There are plenty of people who will say that in the U.S., but I'm not one of them. What I am saying is that he has gone out of his way to not solidify the impression that some Americans are waiting for him to solidify, which is that he's going to get into office and then he's going to give away the store. He's going to redistribute resources to African Americans and away from whites. Has he done that? No, he has not done that. And given that the disparities in the United States with respect to race are enormous, and given that he got almost unanimous support among African Americans, you can make a case that he should have done it. But whether he should have done that or he shouldn't have done that, as a practical matter and as a factual matter, he hasn't done that. And so in answer to the question, has he governed in a fashion consistent with the way he campaigned? My answer is yes, he has.
I have another general question, again, stepping back from your presentation, because we've had debates here in Quebec about the willingness or unwillingness of scholars and academics to tackle on politically charged debates. And I was wondering, in a society where there's so large divides and polarization, to what extent could tackling topics that are delicate, sensitive, or potentially controversial could be problematic, right? Could it lead to attacks from crazies, to backlash? Like, to what extent is your job complicated by the fact that instead of tackling innocuous, trivial, boring topics, you tackle questions like these?
Well, so it's an interesting question, Patrick. Yeah, discussing race in the American context is one of the taboo subjects you're not supposed to talk about, along with sex and religion. So doing research on it is a little bit fraught, I grant you. And then we're not even doing it in the usual way, which is to say, oh, the Republicans, aren't they horrible? They do horrible things. Let's go get them. Instead, I'm saying, well, yeah, they do, but the Democrats kind of do it as well. And that icon that you are, talking about, President Obama, it turns out, yeah, he also did it. So that is a little bit risky. It's not something people are used to hearing. And that's partly why we felt the need to try to marshal as much evidence as possible, because we thought that the likely audience would not be terribly receptive to the notion that the first black president, A, isn't actually viewed as black, number one. And number two, the first black president achieved success in part by promoting the very stereotypes he was supposed to be representing, the very stereotypes he was supposed to be overcoming. He actually played to those stereotypes. So it's a little unusual, but we think that, we wanted to stand out. We wanted to do something different. Is there any kind of potential fallout? I suppose there might be. But, I'm a tenured faculty member. I'll take my chances.
That's very interesting. You mentioned again that he isn't perceived as being black. Why is that?
Yes. We had an interesting conversation at breakfast about the malleability of race. The reason he's not perceived as black, I think, is in part because he doesn't want to be, because he has gone out of his way not to be, because it is politically advantageous that he not be. Now, you might say, well, but he does have a white parent, which he does. But he has made that apparent to people. Now, he's given mixed signals, just to be clear. He has marked black on the census when he filled it out in 2010, I guess. He has indicated to people that he conceives himself as African American. He has described himself as such. But like all politicians, Barack Obama is inclined to give one message to one audience and a different message to a different audience. And so part of the reason why Americans don't think of him as black is in part because he and his campaign and his presidency has not pushed that image out there. That's number one. The other reason is that it is still, in 2014, a stigmatized identity in the United States. A slew of research wholly unrelated to our project, or actually it's related to it, but it's not emerging from it, has found that the darker if you use Photoshop and you essentially darken the skin of Barack Obama, people like him less. If you the incentive people have to think of him as non-black is directly related to the incentive they have to like him. They don't like the label black, and they like this guy, ergo he must not be black.
So you don't think it's enough just the fact that he was successful at that way?
Well, he was doing this before he was successful. Although I guess you could say he was successful in other respects. He was a senator, he was successful, and he was a Harvard law grad, so he's been successful throughout much of his life. But what I'm saying, now you asked me, so I'm giving you my answer. And why is it that most people don't think he's black, which they don't? It's in part because he doesn't want them to, and it's in part because if they thought he was black, they wouldn't like him as much. So they have an incentive in order to avoid cognitive dissonance to avoid that. That's what I'm saying. Yes.
Okay, that might be a controversial question, but I'm known for that, so I'm not going for it. In the larger literature about race in the United States, is he perceived to be black? From a Canadian perspective, he's black, but he's not African American. Because he has no African American roots. His father was born in Africa, So he never lived he doesn't have the same background as the average or the lambda African American. So in the literature, is there a distinction between the fact that it's physically maybe black, but then his baggage is quite different from most African Americans?
I think in the scholarly literature and in the elite description more broadly in terms of journalism, etc., he is depicted almost uniformly as black and or African American. I think that people like all of us in this room who think about, to the extent that we think about Barack Obama, we think of him as a black person. The point of, in part, my study and other studies that have been done is, of course, the way we, those of us in this room, think about politics in general is not the way the average citizen does. And most people in this country, in the United States, I don't know about Canada, actually, but most people in the United States just simply don't think of him as African American for reasons I've gone over. And I think it's a little bit of a disconnect for elites. Again, when I've given this talk or some version of this talk elsewhere in the United States, people were put back like, how can that be that he's the first black president? Of course everybody thinks of him as black, except the evidence says no, they do not. And not just the one study that I made reference to in our presentation this afternoon, and a slew of them. I mean, he just isn't regarded by most people as black. I mean, my explanation for why might be wrong, but the fact of the matter that he isn't regarded that way is not wrong. Yeah.
You might have seen that the Shepard Fairey Hope poster made big during the 2008 campaign. If I remember correctly, they even made it an official poster. I think Obama used it. And I wonder if the fact that he wasn't black on that poster, he was blue, red, and white, if it was considered relevant, if they took it, if they made it that big, because he was more white than black on it.
That's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about that. I mean, obviously it's an iconic image. It's very possible. I mean, I've been controversial throughout this presentation, and purposefully so, but I'm going to even push it even further in response to your question. I think that it isn't simply the fact of his biracial ancestry that complicates this question, but it's about the consequence of it, which is his lighter skin tone. Americans are, they just historically are more likely to embrace lighter skinned African Americans. They're seen as being more acceptable. They're seen as having racial sympathies, which are more acceptable, meaning that they're less inclined to be pro-black. This is true. If you think in the entire history of the United States, only about a handful of African Americans have ever been elected to statewide office, a high-level statewide office like a governor or a senator, or to the presidency. Only about 6 or 7. And almost all of them are racially ambiguous like Barack Obama. Almost without exception. I could, if I were prepared, I could show you images of them. They are, and why is that? Is that it's because most African Americans don't look like that. Most African Americans are closer to my complexion or maybe a little lighter. The reason that that is the case, I would argue, and it is undeniably the case. Edward Brooke, Douglas Wilder. These names may or may not be familiar to you, but you can just Google them and then see what those individuals look like. And I assure you, they don't look like this. The point is that it is